wagon wheel groaned like an old man's bones as it rolled into Dust Whisper. The town barely more than a handful of sun-faded buildings stitched together by stubborn will and prayers that stuck to the dust. The air shimmered under the afternoon sun, thick with the scent of horses and the dry, peppery perfume of sagebrush. Dust rose from the wagons, passing like spirits reluctant to be disturbed. Helena sat upright on the cracked seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, though her fingers ached with every bump in the road. Her silver hair was braided tightly against the wind, and her face, though lined and worn, held a quiet dignity, the kind that grows when life insists you bear more weight than you were built for and you carry it anyway. Beside her, Julia tucked her golden hair behind her ear and peered ahead with wide, steady eyes that were much too old for 20 years. A battered sign greeted them at the edge of town, swinging from rusted chains. Dust Whisper, population 203, it declared, though it seemed an optimistic count. Beyond it, a few souls stirred, a boy chasing a ragged dog, a woman sweeping her stoop, men leaning against the rail of the saloon with a lazy suspicion reserved for newcomers. Helena drew a slow breath, tasting the dryness of the land on her tongue. They had arrived. Not just at Dust Whisper, but at the thin, brittle hope that had carried them across 2 states with little more than a few coins, a creased letter, and Helena's worn hands to shield them from the world. The wagon rolled to a halt outside a building with a wide porch and peeling white paint. A sign above the door read, Miss Hattie's Boarding House, Rooms and Meals. A woman with sharp shoulders and a threadbare apron stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on a cloth, her mouth pressed into a line of cautious welcome. Helena climbed down, joints protesting, and extended a hand to Julia, who leapt lightly to the ground. Their single carpet-bag thudded at their feet, its faded green surface patched so many times it looked like a map of forgotten countries. Miss Hattie watched them for a moment before stepping forward. Her voice was dry as the desert air, but not unkind. "You Helena Price?" Helena nodded, her throat tightening. She produced a crumpled letter from her bodice, the ink faded but legible, bearing the promise of Edgar Burke, a rancher of modest means seeking a wife of good character and practical skills. Helena had stitched every seam of her hope into that letter during endless nights on the trail. Miss Hattie gave the paper a brief glance, then squinted at Helena as if measuring her soul's weight. "Room's ready," she said finally. "You're expected at Burke's place before supper." A muscle in Helena's jaw tightened. She had dreamed of a more gracious welcome, perhaps, but dreams were for those who could afford them. Inside, the boarding house smelled of old wood and boiled beans. Their room was small, the bed sagging in the middle like a tired back, but Julia smiled all the same, setting their bag down carefully as though it were a fine trunk in a grand hotel. Helena sat for a moment on the bed's edge, gathering her breath, smoothing her worn skirt. She could feel Julia's eyes on her, a silent question, a silent faith. No, she would not falter. Not now. Not when the road behind them had already swallowed so much. An hour later, washed and brushed, they stepped back into the heat. Julia wore her best dress, a soft blue faded to the color of distant hills, and Helena had pinned a brooch at her collar, the last piece of fine jewelry she possessed, though its gold was dulled and the clasp a little loose. They made their way to Burke's ranch on foot, the dirt road unfolding before them like an unwritten story. The town was quiet, save for the creak of a weathered sign and the low murmur of voices from the saloon. Windows watched them pass. Men lifted their hats with mechanical politeness. Women peered out, then drew their curtains shut. At the end of the road, past the smithy and the livery, stood a house bigger than most, painted a sullen gray. The yard was fenced but bare, save for a few stubborn tufts of grass and a sagging porch swing. Edgar Burke stood in the shade, thumbs hooked in his belt, a thick man with a chest like a whiskey barrel and a face weathered more by drink than by sun. His eyes flicked over Helena and Julia like a rancher assessing stock. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, Helena, with a grace that owed nothing to circumstance, stepped forward and offered her hand. "Mr. Burke, I am Helena Price, and this is my daughter, Julia." Burke took her hand briefly, his grip perfunctory, and then turned his gaze more fully to Julia. His lip curled slightly, an expression not quite a smile. "You're older than I expected," he said bluntly to Helena, his voice loud enough to carry to the stable boys loitering nearby. "And I didn't order 2 mouths to feed." Julia stiffened beside her mother, but Helena only folded her hands calmly, hiding the tremor that wanted to escape. "The letter explained," she said softly, "that I have a daughter. She is grown and capable. She would be no burden." Burke snorted, a sound like a mule clearing its nose. "I expected someone with prospects," he said, drawing out the word like it tasted sour. "Not two paupers dragging their rags into my life." A hot flush crept up Helena's neck, but she willed herself to stillness, to dignity. Around them, a few townsfolk had paused to watch, the air tightening with a scent of humiliation. Burke stepped back, wiping his hands on his trousers as if dusting off an offense. "I don't need charity cases," he said, turning toward the house. "Find someone else to beg from." The door slammed behind him, leaving Helena and Julia standing alone in the sinking sun, the long shadows of disappointment pooling at their feet. For a moment, neither moved. The town watched through narrowed eyes and twitching curtains, drinking in the small cruelty as if it were a fine show. Helena turned to Julia, her voice steady despite the fracture running through her chest. "Come, my darling. We are not wanted here." Julia's face was pale, but she lifted her chin and took her mother's hand. Together, they walked back toward town, their steps measured, refusing to hurry even as their hearts raced. They returned to Miss Hattie's without speaking. The woman met them at the door, eyes sharp but mouth unsmiling. Without a word, she handed Helena a key to a second-floor room, smaller, cheaper, but a shelter nonetheless. That night, after a supper eaten in heavy silence, Helena sat by the small window, looking out over Dust Whisper. The stars spilled thick and golden across the black sky, and somewhere a coyote called mournfully into the night. Julia had long since curled up on the bed, breathing slow and deep. Helena's fingers worked absently at the hem of her skirt, feeling for loose threads, seeking something to mend, something to fix. But some things could not be sewn back together. Tears blurred her vision, but she blinked them away stubbornly. She had survived too much to be undone by a drunken man and a town's cold shoulders. Beyond the window, the vast land waited, silent, open, merciless and beautiful all at once. Helena leaned her forehead against the cool glass and whispered into the night a prayer not for salvation, but for strength. Somewhere out there, surely, there was a kindness not bought by gold. Somewhere, surely, there was a place where dignity mattered more than coins in a pocket. As she sat there, the stars pulsing in the vastness, Helena promised herself and the daughter she had carried across so many miles that they would not break here. They had come too far. The wind shifted, carrying the faintest scent of something sweeter than dust. A promise, perhaps, or only a lie the land told to keep people hoping. Either way, Helena held it close, tucking it into the battered, stubborn heart that no man could steal from her. Morning would come, and with it, a new reckoning. But tonight, she allowed herself the luxury of imagining that somewhere, kindness stirred its heavy bones and rose to meet the dawn. And maybe, just maybe, it was already reaching for them, unseen in the dark. Morning in Dust Whisper did not so much break as seep in, thin and gray, like a sigh pulled from tired lungs. Helena awoke before the sun fully rose, her body already weary from the weight of the day ahead. Julia still slept curled beneath the worn quilt, her hair a golden spill across the pillow, her brow smooth in dreams untouched yet by disappointment. Helena moved quietly, dressing in the half-light, fingers lingering over the buttons of her dress as though fastening on armor. The day before had pressed bruises into her spirit, but today would be different. Today she would find work, a path, a foothold against the crumbling ground. Downstairs, Miss Hattie ladled out bowls of lumpy oatmeal without comment. A few other boarders shuffled through, most keeping their eyes averted. Helena caught the glance of one man, thin, stoop-shouldered, with ink-stained hands, but he quickly dropped his gaze, as though afraid to catch her misfortune. Julia joined her at the table, spooning the oatmeal dutifully but eating little. Her cheeks were pale in the dim room, but her chin was set with quiet resolve. Helena reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand once, lightly, a silent promise that they would weather this storm together. After breakfast, they ventured out into the town again. The sun was higher now, casting hard shadows between the buildings, baking the dust until it cracked like old paint. Dust Whisper was not a town that gave up its secrets easily. It guarded opportunity like a miser clutching coins. They tried the mercantile first. The owner, a thick-bodied man named Mr. Halston, shook his head before Helena finished speaking. No help needed. Maybe come round harvest. The smithy, the stables, even the small schoolhouse where Helena offered to clean or mend, all met her with the same closed faces, the same polite refusals. By midday, Helena's pride was a threadbare thing, flapping in the dry wind. They paused by the well, drinking in slow sips from the ladle. Helena could feel eyes on them, always watching, measuring, deciding. Women in bonnets whispered behind gloved hands. Men gave tight, shallow nods but no warmth. As they rested, a familiar voice cut through the air, sharp as a blade. Thought you two would have cleared out by now. Helena turned. Edgar Burke leaned against the post outside the saloon, a squat silhouette in the shimmering heat. His voice carried easily in the thin, bright air, drawing attention from the few townsfolk lingering nearby. We ain't got much use for beggars, Burke said, spitting into the dust. Julia stiffened beside her, but Helena laid a calming hand on her arm. She would not let anger soil them. Not here, not before these vultures eager for a show. We seek only honest work, Helena said, her voice even, the rhythm of it steady like a river stone against rushing waters. Burke snorted, loud enough to draw a few dry chuckles from his companions. Honest work, he drawled. Maybe you can stand outside the church and pray folks toss you a coin. The insult hung in the air, thick and ugly. Helena felt it press against her skin, trying to seep into her bones. She refused it, letting it slide away like oil over clean water. A boy, no more than 17, with a freckled face and an awkward slouch, shuffled forward from the shade. His name, Helena would later learn, was Amos Reed. He offered a timid, almost apologetic look. "Ma'am," he said, voice cracking slightly, "you could maybe mend saddles for Mr. Rudd at the livery. His hands ain't what they used to be." Burke barked a laugh. "Yeah, patchin' leather. Maybe that's all you're good for." The townspeople around them shifted, some pretending not to listen, others watching with thinly veiled fascination. Helena met Amos's eyes and gave a small, grateful nod. She would not let Burke decide the shape of her worth. "Thank you, young man," she said with a dignity that made the word ma'am sound noble. Burke's face darkened. He pushed away from the post, swaggering forward a few steps. "You think you're better than the rest of us," he sneered. "You show up here with your rags and your pretty speeches, thinking you're owed something?" Helena stood her ground. Julia stood with her. "We ask for nothing we do not earn," Helena said softly. Burke's lip curled. For a moment, Helena thought he might spit again, but instead he turned on his heel, muttering curses under his breath as he disappeared into the saloon's shadowed doorway. The onlookers drifted away, embarrassed or indifferent. The dust settled, but the echo of the encounter lingered. Julia touched her mother's hand. "Let's find the livery," she said, voice small but unbroken. They found it on the town's far side, near the river where the trees were a little greener, the air a little cooler. Mr. Rudd, an old man with hands knotted like oak roots, peered at them through thick spectacles. "You so strong?" he asked after hearing their need. "Strong and true," Helena said. Rudd nodded slowly. "Got saddles need fixin'. Ain't much pay, but it's honest." That afternoon, Helena sat in the shade of the livery barn, stitching cracked leather with sure hands. Julia helped, steadying the heavy pieces, learning the work with quick fingers and quicker eyes. The smell of horses and oiled leather wrapped around them, warm and earthy. It was not the future Helena had envisioned when she first answered Edgar Burke's letter. It was not the dream she had spun by firelight, whispering of better days. But it was a beginning. From time to time, people passed the open barn doors. Some ignored them. Some stared. A few, like Amos, offered awkward nods of encouragement. The world, Helena knew, did not change in grand flourishes. It shifted in the smallest of ways. A kind glance, a door not slammed shut, a hand offering work instead of mockery. At sundown, when the sky was 100 shades of bruised lavender and molten gold, Helena and Julia returned to the boarding house. Their fingers sore, but their heads held higher than when they had set out. Miss Hattie met them at the door with a plate of cornbread and beans set aside from supper. "Eat," she said, brusque, but the twitch at the corner of her mouth betrayed a deeper sentiment. Helena thanked her, and she and Julia ate slowly, savoring each bite as though it were a feast. Food tasted different when it was paid for with honest labor. Later, when Julia had drifted into sleep, Helena sat again by the window. The stars began to prick the darkening sky, each one a stubborn ember refusing to be swallowed by night. She thought of the day, the shame, the kindness, the labor, and felt something stir inside her, small but vital. Not hope, not yet, but something close to it. Something like a seed buried deep beneath the dust, waiting for rain. Beyond the town, the land stretched out into the great unknown, vast and wild and merciless. Yet Helena found herself breathing easier under its endless sky than she ever had beneath the low, stifling ceilings of a life spent chasing security that had always slipped just out of reach. She pressed her hand to the glass again, feeling its coolness seep into her skin. They had been humiliated. They had been rejected. And yet, they were still standing. Still moving forward. Still becoming something stronger than circumstance could shape or ruin. Tomorrow would bring more dust, more labor, perhaps more cruelty. But it would also bring the chance, however slim, to carve out a place in this harsh, unwelcoming land. A place where silver hair and patched dresses and stubborn hearts could build something that looked, from a certain angle, like home. Helena let her eyes close for a moment, listening to the soft breathing of her daughter behind her, the whisper of the night wind outside, the steady thud of her own enduring heart. In the darkness, she smiled. Small. Defiant. Alive. Morning bloomed slow and gentle over Dust Whisper, softening the hard lines of the town with a blush of gold. Helena sat on the narrow porch of Miss Hattie's boarding house, her sewing basket at her feet, mending a tear in a harness strap Mr. Rudd had sent home with her. Her needle moved steadily through the cracked leather, each stitch a quiet act of defiance against despair. Julia swept the dust from the steps with a worn broom, the hem of her patched skirt stirring the pale dirt. Her face was calm, almost serene, but Helena caught the small crease between her brows, the silent worry tucked into her expression like a secret. The town stirred around them, slow as a waking bear. Wagons rattled over the rutted street. The blacksmith's hammer rang out in a steady rhythm, shaping stubborn iron into something useful. Crows perched atop the livery roof, watching with beady black eyes. Helena bent lower over her work, but her hands faltered when the sound of approaching footsteps brushed the edges of her awareness. 2 sets, one heavy and deliberate, the other light and hesitant. She looked up. A man approached, his figure broad and solid, moving with a slow steadiness that spoke of years spent carrying burdens without complaint. Beside him walked a boy not much older than Julia, lanky and awkward, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn trousers. The man removed his hat as he neared, revealing hair grizzled at the temples, his face weathered but strong. His eyes were the color of old cedar, deep and calm, and when they met Helena's, something ancient and kind stirred in her chest. "Morning," he said, voice low and roughened like stones tumbled by a river. Helena set her sewing aside, rising with a grace born of habit more than hope. "Good morning," she replied, smoothing her skirts. The man hesitated, shifting his weight. The boy cast shy glances at Julia, who, sensing his discomfort, smiled a small, encouraging smile. "My name's Silas McCade," the man said. "This here's my son, Jesse." Helena inclined her head. "Helena Price. And my daughter, Julia." The introductions floated between them, soft as dandelion seeds. Silas cleared his throat. "Miss Hattie said you're handy with a needle." Helena nodded. "I do what I can." Silas pulled a bundle from beneath his arm, a saddle blanket torn clean through, the heavy weave frayed and sagging. "Could use mending. Ain't much good at sewing myself." Helena accepted the bundle carefully, running her fingers over the worn fibers. She could almost hear the stories stitched into the fabric, long rides across lonely plains, cold nights under uncaring stars. "I can fix this," she said simply. Silas's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close enough. "I can pay you fair," he added. $1 and supper, if you join us." Helena blinked, the offer catching her off guard. Not just pay. A meal. An invitation. Julia glanced at her, eyes bright with cautious hope. That would be most kind, Helena said, inclining her head again. Silas nodded once, tipping his hat before turning back the way he had come, Jesse trailing after him like a young colt still unsure of his footing. Helena watched them go, the bundle cradled against her chest, and felt something unfamiliar and dangerous stir in her, a softening, a crack where hope might seep in. They spent the afternoon working. Helena mended the blanket with firm, even stitches while Julia helped in small ways, fetching scissors, holding thread, asking quiet questions about the work. By the time the sun tilted toward evening, casting long shadows across the town, the blanket was whole again, stronger at the broken places. Julia wrapped it carefully in brown cloth while Helena washed her hands, scrubbing away the dust and weariness. When they set out toward the McCade place, the town watched them again. But this time, there were fewer sneers. A nod here. A tip of the hat there. Small signs, like green shoots poking through winter's last frost. The McCade homestead sat at the edge of town, nestled against a slope where cottonwoods whispered secrets to the wind. The house was plain but well kept, the fence mended, the roof patched against the storms that would surely come. Silas met them at the gate, his hands rough but clean, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows. He led them inside where the smells of roasting meat and fresh bread filled the air so thick it nearly brought Helena to tears. The meal was simple, stew heavy with root vegetables, cornbread sweetened with a touch of honey, but it was shared freely, and that made it feast enough. Conversation flowed in fits and starts, awkward but genuine. Jesse stole glances at Julia, stumbling over his words when she asked him about the horses he helped tend. Silas listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, his words were measured and thoughtful, like stones placed carefully to build something that would endure. Helena found herself laughing once, a soft sound she had not heard from her own lips in far too long. Silas's eyes crinkled at the corners when he heard it, as if he recognized the rarity of the gift. After supper, they moved to the porch, where the stars unfolded in their endless tapestry overhead. Jesse showed Julia how to whistle through a blade of grass. The two of them huddled together, their laughter weaving through the night air. Silas sat beside Helena, not too close, his presence a quiet reassurance rather than a demand. "You done good work," he said, nodding toward the mended blanket folded neatly on the porch rail. "Thank you," Helena said. He shifted slightly, as if gathering himself. "Ain't much in this town for folks that don't fit neat into their boxes," he said after a moment. "But there's good people if you know where to look." Helena followed his gaze to Jesse and Julia, their silhouettes sharp against the starlit field. "I'm beginning to see that," she murmured. Silas was silent for a long moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a small pouch. Inside were coffee beans, glossy and fragrant. "Figured you might like these," he said, almost shy. Helena accepted the gift with hands that trembled slightly. Coffee was no small offering in Dust Whisper. It was a luxury, a kindness distilled into a few precious ounces. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick. Silas only nodded, his gaze steady on the horizon. When it came time to leave, Jesse insisted on walking them back to the boarding house, carrying the small bundle of leftovers Miss Hattie would surely grumble about but secretly appreciate. At the porch steps, Jesse shuffled his feet, scuffing the dirt. "Miss Julia," he said, voice cracking slightly, maybe you'd like to see the new foal sometime." Julia smiled, her whole face lighting up. "I'd like that very much," she said. Helena watched the exchange, her heart swelling and aching all at once. In their room, as Julia tucked the coffee beans carefully into the drawer beside their few treasures, Helena sat on the bed and let the quiet wash over her. She thought of Silas's steady hands, Jesse's shy hopefulness, the laughter threaded through the evening like a new, delicate tapestry. Kindness had come to them, not in grand gestures, but in the soft, persistent way rivers carve canyons. Not all at once, but surely, inevitably. Helena lay down, pulling the thin quilt over her, and stared at the ceiling long after Julia's breathing deepened into sleep. There was still so much to fear. Poverty, prejudice, the hard winters and harder men. But there was also this, a mended blanket. A boy's shy invitation. A pouch of coffee beans heavy in her daughter's hands. Small things. But small things, Helena knew, had a way of growing roots in the deep places. Outside, the cottonwoods whispered in the night wind, and somewhere in the darkness, a new future, fragile and stubborn, stretched its first green fingers toward the light. The summer days settled into a rhythm, slow and sure as a river winding through a thirsty land. Helena rose each morning with the first pink whisper of dawn, her hands finding purpose in small labors, mending harnesses, patching shirts, helping Miss Hattie with washing when the boarding house grew busy. Julia found chores at the livery, brushing horses, cleaning stalls, learning the soft language of patience that animals demanded. The town of Dust Whisper, wary at first, began to nod when they passed. Mr. Halston at the mercantile grunted in approval when Helena mended a seam in one of his supply sacks without being asked. Widow Marla, whose sharp tongue could skin a man alive, found herself with a freshly patched quilt and no bill presented. Even Sheriff Tomlin, leaning against his post with a lazy watchfulness, tipped his hat more often now, as if acknowledging something sturdy and true growing under the town's brittle surface. Silas McCade became a quiet, steady presence in their days. He would stop by the boarding house with small repairs needing a skilled hand, or sometimes nothing at all except a nod and a jar of preserves to leave on the porch. Jesse, in his shy, stumbling way, hovered close to Julia whenever he could, his affection blooming slow and awkward, like a sunflower turned uncertainly toward the sun. One cool morning, Silas arrived with a battered toolbox and a quiet proposal. "The smithy could use another set of hands," he said, looking not at Helena but just past her, as if offering her a way to refuse without shame. "You're good with stitching. Hammering's not too different." Helena hesitated. The forge was no place for a woman, not in the eyes of most. Dust Whisper might have softened toward her, but old habits died hard, and the forge was a place of fire and sweat and men who spoke with their fists more than their mouths. Still, the thought of honest work, of coin earned not out of pity but skill, set a small flame burning in her chest. "I would be honored," she said simply. Silas's mouth twitched in that almost smile she had come to recognize as something rarer and finer than the broad grins of younger men. The forge was hotter than the sun at high noon, the air thick with the tang of iron and smoke. Helena learned quickly, her hands strong and sure despite the weight of the hammer. She was no blacksmith, not truly, but she could fashion simple repairs, shoe a horse in a pinch, and craft iron fittings that held fast against the pull of the world. There were stares, of course. Men muttering behind cupped hands, women whispering in the churchyard. But there were also nods from the weary farmers whose tools she mended and the ranchers whose horses ran easier under her careful hand. Still, doubt crept in the quieter hours, slipping between the cracks of her newfound strength. Late at night, Helena would sit by the window, the stars wheeling overhead, and wonder if they were merely tolerated, not accepted. If this fragile life they were building could be torn down with a single cruel word, a single pointed finger. Julia noticed her mother's silences and began to fill them with small joys: flowers plucked from the riverbank, pies baked with stolen apples, laughter coaxed from Jessie with clumsy jokes and bright smiles. Helena watched her daughter with a bittersweet ache, marveling at the resilience of youth, the way it could reach for happiness even in soil salted with sorrow. But even Julia could not hold back the shadows that sometimes gathered at the edges of their days. Edgar Burke, though quieter now, had not disappeared. He nursed his humiliation like a slow-burning coal, whispering poison into eager ears. Stories about Helena and Julia found their way into the town's undercurrent, that they were freeloaders, charity cases, women of no proper standing. One afternoon, as Helena left the smithy with arms aching and heart lighter than it had been in years, she found a scrap of paper pinned to the boarding-house door. It bore a single word, scrawled in a rough, angry hand: "Takers." Miss Hattie tore it down without a word, crumpling it into her apron pocket, but the damage was done. That night, Helena lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, her heart pounding a slow, painful rhythm. The doubts she had kept at bay with work and purpose flooded in, washing over her careful defenses. Were they truly welcome here? Or merely endured until something better came along? She rose quietly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, and stepped outside into the cool hush of the night. The town lay still, cloaked in silvered darkness. Lights glimmered faintly in distant windows, stars mirrored in glass. The earth smelled of dust and sage and the faint, lingering smoke from the forge. She wandered without thinking, her feet carrying her to the outskirts where the cottonwoods whispered secrets only the wind could understand. There, at the fence line of the McCade place, she found Silas. He sat on the low rail, pipe in hand, gazing up at the sky as if seeking answers written among the stars. He turned when he heard her approach, his face softening in the moonlight. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low, almost blending into the night sounds. Helena shook her head, wrapping the shawl tighter around her. For a moment, they simply sat there in silence, the quiet between them comfortable, like an old quilt worn to perfect softness. Finally, she spoke. "Do you ever wonder," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, "if all we're doing is delaying the inevitable? If no matter how hard we work, we'll always be seen as less?" Silas was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his words were measured, weighed carefully like gold dust on a scale. "Folks see what they want to see," he said. "Some only know how to measure worth by the weight of a man's pocket or the shine on his boots." He paused, his gaze steady on hers. "But some," he said slowly, "some measure by different things. By how steady your hands are when the storm comes. By whether you reach out when others turn away." Helena felt the knot in her chest loosen, just a little. Silas knocked the ash from his pipe, tucking it into his pocket. "You and your girl," he said, rising to stand before her. "You've built more here with nothing but grit and grace than some men do with acres of land and barns full of stock." He tipped his hat slightly, a gesture of quiet respect. "Don't let the small souls tear you down." Helena swallowed hard, the night air cool against the sudden sting in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, the word simple but soaked with meaning. Silas only nodded, then turned back toward his house, his broad shoulders disappearing into the dark. Helena stood there a while longer, feeling the earth solid beneath her feet, the stars vast and patient overhead. When she returned to the boarding house, she found Julia waiting by the window, worry etched into her young face. Without a word, Helena crossed the room and gathered her daughter into her arms, holding her fiercely, feeling the bright, strong pulse of life within her. They would not run. They would not cower. They would endure. The next morning brought more than sunlight. It brought a quiet, steady defiance that rooted itself deeper than any hurtful word could reach. Helena returned to the forge, her hands surer than before, her back straighter. Julia rode out with Jessie to the far pasture, helping mend a broken fence, laughing when the young colt nibbled at her braid. The town watched, of course. They always would. But some watched now with something softer in their eyes. Respect, perhaps, or at least the reluctant acknowledgement that dignity was not so easily crushed. Amos Reed, the freckled boy who had once offered her the chance to mend saddles, stopped by the smithy with a broken bridle and a shy, earnest grin. "Could use your help, Miss Price," he said, scratching the back of his neck. Helena smiled, taking the worn leather from his hands. "Of course, Amos," she said. "Happy to." Each stitch she made, each nail she hammered, each kind word she returned, all of it wove itself into the fabric of Dust Whisper, quiet but unyielding. The town might never embrace them fully, might never erase the scars of that first cruel welcome. But Helena no longer needed them to. She had Julia's laughter, Jessie's clumsy, blooming devotion, Silas's steady, wordless faith. She had her own 2 hands, her own 2 feet, her own fierce, unbending spirit. And in the end, that would be enough. As summer ripened into the golden edge of autumn, the cottonwoods shedding their first yellow leaves, Helena realized something she had never dared hope for. They were not merely surviving anymore. They were living. They were growing roots deep into the stubborn, stingy soil of Dust Whisper, roots strong enough to hold against any storm. And somewhere ahead, not in a dream, not in a letter, but here, in the hard-earned, dust-choked reality of their days, a future waited, patient and unbreakable. A future she and Julia would walk toward hand in hand, no longer as beggars or outcasts, but as women who had carved a place for themselves in a world that had tried to shut them out. A future that was, at last, their own. Autumn rolled into Dust Whisper with a softer kind of gold, the sunlight thicker, slower, as though reluctant to abandon the land it had baked all summer. The cottonwoods by the river shed their leaves in slow whirls, like forgotten letters drifting down from heaven. In the mornings, the air carried a cool bite, the promise of winter stitched into the wind's sharp breath. Helena stood on the porch of the boarding house, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, watching the town stretch and wake beneath the vast, endless sky. Beside her, Julia fidgeted, smoothing the skirt of her simple green dress, her cheeks flushed with a nervous excitement Helena hadn't seen since they first set foot here months ago. Today was the harvest fair, the one day when Dust Whisper shook off its dust and hardship and dressed itself in laughter and color. Stalls lined the main street, tables heavy with pies, preserves, quilts, and hand-forged tools. There would be games for the children, races for the young men, and a pie contest where Julia had, after much coaxing from Jessie, promised to compete. It felt like a different world from the one that had first spat them onto its streets, and yet the memory of that welcome still clung to the edges of Helena's mind, a shadow she could not quite shake. Julia caught her gaze and smiled, and the sight of it, so earnest, so bright, scattered the lingering ghosts like leaves before a strong wind. They made their way down the street, skirts brushing against the dusty ground, heads held high. People greeted them now with real smiles, nods that carried weight, not pity. Miss Hattie waved from her stall of knitted goods, a glint of approval in her shrewd eyes. Sheriff Tomlin, polishing an apple on his worn sleeve, tipped his hat with a wide, easy grin. At the far end of the street, Jesse waited by the pie contest table, rocking back and forth on his heels, hands shoved deep into his pockets. His hair, sun-bleached and stubborn, stuck out in every direction, and when he caught sight of Julia, his whole face lit up like the first star at dusk. Helena watched the two of them with a swelling ache of tenderness. Jesse held out his arm with exaggerated gallantry, and Julia looped hers through it, laughing as he escorted her to the contest table. Silas appeared at Helena's side, his step so quiet she only noticed him when his shadow merged with hers. He wore his best shirt, the fabric stretched taut over his broad shoulders, the cuffs brushed clean of soot. In one hand, he carried a small bundle wrapped carefully in oilcloth. "You look fine," he said, voice low enough that she felt it more than heard it. Helena turned her head, a smile ghosting over her mouth. "You clean up well yourself," she replied. Silas chuckled, a rumble deep in his chest. Together, they watched as Julia set her pie among the others, its crust imperfect but golden, the filling fragrant with stolen apples and a sprinkle of hope. The judges, including Miss Hattie and the schoolmarm, Miss Leona, made a slow, solemn procession past the table, tasting each entry with the gravity of kings selecting a new crown. Helena hardly dared breathe. When they finally reached Julia's pie, Jesse leaned forward so eagerly he nearly toppled into the table. Julia's hands twisted in the folds of her skirt, her face a study in hope and terror. Miss Hattie took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, then raised one sparse eyebrow in the way that meant either profound approval or deep suspicion. Miss Leona nodded once, brisk and decisive. At last, after a long, unbearable pause, they pinned the blue ribbon to Julia's pie. The street erupted in applause, hoots, and a few good-natured whistles. Julia clapped a hand over her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief, and Jessie hooped loud enough to startle the horses tied outside the saloon. Helena felt laughter bubble up inside her, warm and fierce, and she let it rise without shame. Beside her, Silas grinned, his pride in Julia as evident as if she had been his own blood. They made their way toward the contest table, but before Helena could cross the street, a shadow detached itself from the mouth of the saloon. Edgar Burke. His face was red, not from drink this time, but from some deeper, fouler anger. His eyes gleamed with a nasty sort of satisfaction as he stepped into the street, blocking their path. "Well, look at that," he drawled, voice thick with contempt. "Even beggars get blue ribbons now." The words cracked across the bright afternoon like a whip. The laughter died. Conversations faltered. Dust Whisper watched, the whole town holding its breath. Helena straightened her shoulders, her heart hammering against her ribs. She met Burke's gaze without flinching. "We've earned our place," she said, her voice calm but carrying. Burke sneered. "Place?" he spat. "You don't belong here. You never did. Just a couple of charity cases play-acting at decent folk." A few murmurs stirred the crowd, but no one stepped forward. "Not yet." Burke took a step closer, looming. "You think a pie and a few mended boots make you one of us?" he hissed. Silas moved then, slow but inexorable, like a storm gathering strength. He stepped between Helena and Burke, his stance loose but unyielding. "That's enough," Silas said, voice low and sure. Burke laughed, a harsh bark. "Course you'd side with the silver-haired charity bride," he said, loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Too proud to find a proper wife, so you settle for what's left over." For a moment, the world narrowed to the space between them. The air crackled, heavy with anger, fear, and something older, the deep, bone-deep knowledge that some battles were not fought with fists but with the refusal to bow. Helena stepped forward, laying a hand lightly on Silas's arm. She faced Burke herself, her silver hair catching the sunlight, her eyes steady. "You call me left over," she said softly, "but I have built a life from less than nothing. I have stitched hope into broken places and taught my daughter to stand tall even when the world tries to break her. I am not ashamed of what I am." Burke sneered, but the certainty in Helena's voice, the strength woven through her words, struck him harder than any blow could. The silence deepened. Then Sheriff Tomlin stepped out from the crowd, his boots kicking up little puffs of dust. "That's enough, Burke," he said, voice like gravel. "You cause any more trouble, you'll answer to me." Burke hesitated, anger flickering across his face, but he saw the faces in the crowd, not sneering, not laughing, and he knew he had already lost. With a muttered curse, he turned and slunk back into the saloon's shadow. The tension broke like a snapped rope. Applause rippled through the street, not loud but sincere. Miss Hattie nodded once, a small, sharp movement of approval. Jessie hooped again, grabbing Julia's hand and spinning her in a clumsy, joyful circle that made her laugh until she had to lean against him to stay upright. Helena stood still for a moment, letting it all wash over her. The victory, the validation, the simple, astonishing truth that they had not just survived Dust Whisper. They had claimed it. Silas turned to her, pulling something from his pocket. It was a small box, hand-carved from cedar, the grain polished to a deep, rich glow. He opened it, revealing a simple silver ring, shaped like two hands clasped together. No grand speeches. No kneeling in the dust. Just Silas, steady and sure, offering her something real. Helena felt her throat tighten. She placed her hand in his, and he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Jessie, emboldened by the day's victories, pulled a small locket from his pocket and pressed it into Julia's hand. Inside was a single word, etched with careful, clumsy love. Hope. The sun dipped low, setting the world ablaze in molten gold. Dust Whisper shimmered, the buildings, the people, the wide sky itself wrapped in a light so tender it felt like a blessing. Helena looked around, at Julia, laughing in Jessie's arms, at Silas, whose steady presence had become the foundation of her new life, at the town that had tested her and found her worthy. She felt the old wounds still, but they no longer bled. They had become scars, strong and clean, reminders not of defeat but of resilience. She raised her face to the sky, breathing deep of the dust and sage and the sharp, sweet scent of change. In the hush of the golden evening, with the wind whispering secrets only the brave dared to hear, Helena knew the truth she had carried all along, hidden deep in the marrow of her bones. Love was not measured by wealth or youth or perfection. It was measured by the hands that reached for you when you stumbled, by the hearts that stood beside you when you had nothing left but your own stubborn hope, by the quiet, unwavering truth that no matter how rough the road, some journeys led you exactly where you were meant to be. Helena smiled, a small, fierce smile, and whispered a promise into the rising night. They would never be left behind again. They had come home.